Well, with us now are Elissa Baer, who's the senior investment director at Investec, Claire McNeil, who's from the Institute for Public Policy Research, and Gillian Tett, who's assistant editor of the Financial Times. How big a deal is this tomorrow?
I think it's a very big deal because essentially, as Paul says, the news has only got worse in terms of the macroeconomic situation, and the Chancellor faces two extremely nasty balancing acts. Somehow he has to both persuade the markets that he's not abandoning austerity, and yet he's keeping growth on track by not going overboard. He has to kind of walk a tightrope there. At the same time, though, he has to persuade the population that what he's doing is fair and get people to buy into it. And that's like, you know, a parent with 2 cups of cream trying to divide it between 3 kids. I mean, whatever happens, everyone's going to complain.
Or everyone gets a few crumbs, perhaps.
Exactly.
Supposing that we were to lose our AAA rating, as was alluded to there a couple of times, how big a deal would that be?
Well, I think for the last year or so we've just lived with smoke and mirrors. Do we really have a AAA rating? And even worse than us is the United States, who won't even talk about the subject. So I think that is a concern. But Gillian and I were looking. I mean, I look after private investors. Can we touch government stocks at the moment? I mean, the prices are inflated beyond belief, so that if you hold them, all you're going to do is lose money. So the markets are actually saying there's a query on the status, even though it hasn't been altered.
Would it matter if we lost our AAA status?
Well, it matters obviously for our borrowing. Yes, it does matter, and it is all about status, and they don't want to lose it. But I think if you look at the countries that have been downgraded, we're not too far off in some respects.
We're all in the same boat, or not all. Most of us are in the same boat, aren't we?
Yes, and the boat's not very happy.
Right.
But, I mean, to be cynical, if there was ever a good moment to lose your credit rating, it's probably now. Because the reality is that a lot of Europe is in deep problems, and the US is engulfed in this huge, great debate about whether it can actually get some kind of budget deal before it goes over the fiscal cliff, has a crisis in 2 weeks' time. So actually, investors aren't necessarily going to be able to rush out and find another safe haven if they lose faith with the UK. It will be painful, but right now it's probably about as good time as you can have.
Let me bring in Claire McNeil here. This pledge that George Osborne made, we're all in this together, it doesn't look like that any longer, does it?
Well, it doesn't. I mean, we know at the moment that the burden that's being placed on low to middle income families is very high. Most of the cuts that are being made are from public services, from welfare cuts, rather than from tax rises. And we know that those on the lowest incomes use public services more. They tend to rely on welfare more. So at the moment, it seems that the poorest, in some ways, are shouldering the majority of the burden here.
You rather agree?
I completely agree. I mean, I know quite a lot about a community up in Liverpool who are seeing some potentially horrible cuts coming down the road. And there's already high levels of unemployment. People really rely on public services there. And just to take a small example, these days the government's putting more and more of its services online. It assumes everyone has internet. Up there in this part of Liverpool they don't. And the library has just been shut, which provided the internet access. So that's a kind of on-the-ground little detail where people are really suffering and where tomorrow's budget is just going to add to the squeeze, as Claire says.
And you say just carry on letting the debt mount.
Well, no, I mean, I think, you need to take a sensible approach to deficit reduction. We think that when the economy is weak, as it is at the moment, you should slow down the pace, speed it up once the economy is stronger. But also you can think about how you can introduce policies that will boost the economy at the same time as supporting families. So childcare, for example, raising the female employment rate would obviously be positive, improving our tax base. We need to be thinking more about those kinds of policies.
If the Chancellor were to listen to that sort of counsel, to pay heed to the social damage that sounds as if it's being done by cuts that have already been made and will be made, what will be the consequence as far as somebody like you looking at the economy is concerned?
Well, I think the other thing is the more you do this, the worse it's getting, and we're not very far down the line. I think that's the other problem. It's going to get worse, and that's another thing that makes it more and more unattractive. But I suppose our side, we look after people who I think have saved, who have made efforts, who have been prudent, and he's looking at that all the time and trying to reduce what they've got. I mean, I'm seeing more and more clients give more money to their children, and the children are in their 50s. I mean, it's just a spiral at the moment. I mean, I can't see inheritance tax going to be much of a problem because they're not going to have it to pay. It's hitting middle, the middle all the time. So you're not serving the lower because they haven't got it, and you're attacking the middle.
And presumably these people who have savings are damaged once inflation gets going, and that's another suggestion, that you kind of relax inflation targets and the debt starts to go away gradually.
Yes, and deposit rates are not going to go up any time, are they?
Right.
What's desperately needed is somebody who can actually rally the country around some common vision and almost invoke that kind of Churchillian Blitz spirit of we're all in this together and that the pain will be there.
That's what they claim to be doing.
Well, that's what they've been trying. The problem is they've been trying to do that now for 3 years. And you can pull that kind of rallying cry once or twice when you've got a clear-cut enemy. Right now people are confused about how long this is going to last, who exactly is responsible for this, and above all else, is the pain being shared out fairly? And do people still have enough incentive to buy into this kind of vision that the Chancellor is going to be trying to present tomorrow?
Does any of you feel, I mean, you've got different ideas of who's being unfairly penalised, but does any of you feel that there's any fairness in this strategy? Do you, Gillian?
I think they're certainly trying to find that. I think it was very telling that they've now taken to pointing the finger at foreign corporations, because that's a very convenient way to try and say, yes, we're going to get more tax from them, whether it's Starbucks or Google or somebody else like that. I think we're going to see more and more of that going forward.
I mean, the Chancellor is clearly trying to position this budget as fair. There are measures that will try and hit those at the top, restricting pension tax relief, for example, for high earners, corporate tax, as Gillian says, and also measures to support people on middle incomes, freezing fuel duty, for example. But the reality is that there are some very difficult choices to be made. It's positive that there's money going into infrastructure, for example, but continuing to squeeze public services and frontline services will be squeezed. Isn't sustainable.
This question about choices is an illusion, isn't it? There's no room for manoeuvre.
There's a question about the balancing act. They're walking down a high wire right now, and very subtle presentation issues and very subtle swings to the right or left could have quite an important impact.
Do you feel there's much room for choice?
No, and I think the other problem is that politics are too short-term. I mean, what they're looking is to 2015, and then they've said not much will happen while there's a coalition. I mean, you actually need to do things, and you will upset perhaps more people, but maybe you can start moving this economy, and that's what's important.
If the predicament is so great and the area for manoeuvre is so very, very narrow, it does rather make you think what 2015 is going to be about in the next election, whether anyone can really offer anything terribly different, doesn't it?
No, and I think there's an international disillusionment with politics, which is correct. I mean, what can they do? But I think the talking about it, people are fed up with that. Actually, you do need to do something. I mean, I've just come from a charity dinner. I mean, more and more is being put on the charities. I mean, where do they think the money's coming from?
Well, Claudio Borio from the BIS, who is the chief economist from the Bank of International Settlements, the central bank of the central bank, gave a devastating speech recently where he pointed out that the real problem is that economic cycles tend to happen in multi-decade periods and governments only last for a few years. And you have this fundamental clash right now that you need governments to be able to take a 5-10 year view, and yet unfortunately they're looking at 1 or 2 years at the most, and that's a real problem.
Well, there's no way around that, is there?
Not at the moment, no.
Not if you believe in democracy.
Not unless you start looking at more technocratic solutions like Mario Monti in Italy or something like that.
Got a candidate in mind in this country?
No, but maybe the next decade or two is going to be about people questioning, the balance of how democracy works and looking at more technocratic solutions, because the economic choices confronting the West right now are so painful that the pressure is not going to evaporate quickly.
There are clearly tough choices, but I think we shouldn't be too, throw up our hands too much. I mean, there are decisions that can be made now, so investing more in skills and apprenticeships, for example, which would improve levels of production in our economy, move us towards a more innovative economy, policies like childcare, for example, which can produce more bang for their buck. So I think we must also think about what can be done in the here and now, as well as considering the very difficult situation that we find ourselves in.
On a lower scale, you take the paper, actually everything's happened with the paper, but something like the Standard, when they have a campaign to get people out there to help, people to go into schools, people to help with reading, people come forward. It is motivating people in the right way. I mean, I'm talking to my clients, in the Olympics. The Olympics did do a great thing, and I've just been away and people said, gosh, England, absolutely fantastic what you did. If you actually built on something like that, that is progress, getting people all facing the same way and seeing there's a benefit.
Okay, thank you all very much. Thank you. The American Congress looks to be on the verge of passing a law